When you think about innovations, undoubtedly you think about technological innovations, like this cell phone. But I'm going to talk to you today about a different kind of innovation, social innovations. And in particular, you'll learn about a subset of social innovations called practice innovations. And we can have practice innovations in all kinds of practices, recreational practices, consumer buying practices, as well as civic ecology practices. So you may be wondering, why am I standing here holding these sticks? Well, the reason is because these sticks are part of one of the most amazing practice innovations of our generation. So these carbon fiber sticks were first marketed by a Finnish sporting goods company called Excel, and that was in 1996. And Excel Sporting Goods had two purposes envisioned for these sticks, or two practices in which they would be used. So the first was that they would be used by the infirm, right? Walking kind of like as using a cane. And the second was that they would be used by competitive athletes for training. For example, skiers during the off-season. But unfortunately for Excel, neither of these practices took off. And what happened next, and this is the part of the story where I think you'll come to understand why I think these sticks are part of the most amazing practice innovation of our generation, given my demographic, is that a group of middle-aged ladies decided to do something different with these sticks. Now these ladies, they were a little too young to need the sticks as a cane, but they were also too old to use them for training. They weren't competitive athletes. So what did they do with these sticks? What they decided was that they would use the sticks for just everyday recreational walking. So they wanted to use the sticks for fun activities, exercise that they could do with their friends after work or on the weekend. And the amazing thing about this new practice that they developed, this practice innovation that came to be called Nordic Walking, is that walking using these sticks actually uses up 20 to 40% more calories than walking without the sticks. And what's more, it uses over 100 muscles in the human body. And luckily for Excel, this new practice, this Nordic Walking, went viral. So not only did it spread across Finland and Scandinavia, and then it spread to Europe and China, but if you've hiked down a trail recently in the US or walked down a sidewalk, undoubtedly you've heard the clickety-clack of Nordic walkers. So why is all this important? What can we learn from this example of the Nordic Walking practice innovation? Well, the first is that this practice innovation, Nordic Walking, was not developed or invented by some genius at Harvard or MIT, and not even by the company Excel. Instead, Nordic Walking as a practice innovation was produced or created, or at least co-produced, by middle-aged ladies. And the second thing that we can learn from this is, how did these middle-aged ladies actually invent this practice of Nordic Walking? What they did was they repurposed, or they recombined, 3 different elements that are part of all practices. The first practice element is the physical or the material object, in our cases, the sticks. And they repurposed these sticks from something that was used for walking by the infirm, or something that was used by a competitive athlete, and something that was just used by the everyday person for normal walking. The second element is the meaning, and they also repurposed the meanings. So originally the sticks would have been associated with infirmity or old age, or with extreme athletes. But they repurposed the meaning so that they're associated with just everyday recreation, with healthy exercise to improve our health. And then finally, the third element of practices are skills. And so in their case, the skill is walking or Nordic walking. Well, I'm feeling a little exhausted from all this Nordic walking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get rid of these sticks, and I'm going to apply what we've learned to civic ecology practices as practice innovations. So civic ecology stewards, similar to those middle-aged ladies, they repurpose the three elements of a practice when they create a new civic ecology practice. So the first element that we talked about was that material or physical object. In the cases of the Nordic walkers, it was the sticks. But in a civic ecology practice, it's actually the resource. This could be a physical resource, like a rooftop. It could be a living resource, like wildlife or an animal, like an oyster. Or it could simply be a neglected river or a park. And the second thing they do is they repurpose meanings. So for example, when you change the resource, an asphalt roof, to a rooftop garden, you change its meaning. I was privileged to work with an incredible artist in New York City, and one of the things that she did was she installed rooftop gardens on apartment buildings throughout New York. And she talked about how when she was on her rooftop in her garden, in her neighborhood, she could look out and see all these other rooftop gardens, those of her neighbors, and she looked out and she could see these other people or these neighbors working in these gardens. And she described rooftop gardens in this way. She called them islands of community in the sky. We could also think about repurposing the meaning of an animal like an oyster. So you might think of oysters as slimy invertebrates, or perhaps as a culinary delicacy. But oyster gardeners, one type of civic ecology steward, they repurposed the meaning of oysters. They think of oysters as the filter, as the organism that's cleaning the contaminants out of the estuary. And they've actually called the oyster the liver of the estuary. Now, we can also repurpose the meaning of a particular practice. So again, let's take gardening. If I plant a garden as a middle-aged lady in front of my house, I might ascribe certain meanings to it, like it's something pretty, it's something that I can use to show off to my neighbors. But if I become a community gardening, then the meanings of that practice becomes quite different. Community gardening, the meaning of community gardening, it becomes a way of giving back to the community, of connecting across ethnic groups and different generations. And finally, there are a number of skills involved in civic ecology practices. There are decision-making skills, like who's inside, who can participate in the practice, and who can't participate, or do we allow pesticides in a community garden? There's people skills, like mobilizing volunteers and building collaborations. And there's also technical skills, like constructing green roofs or culturing oysters. And there's even some quite unusual skills, technical skills, that you might learn through participating in a civic ecology practice. Recently, I participated in a cleanup activity at the Ithaca City Cemetery. It was an activity of the Friends of the Ithaca City Cemetery, a small friends group. And one of the things that we did was we learned to clean off the gravestones, to clean off the moss and the algae so that you could see the ancient inscriptions. But we also learned to piece back together shattered gravestones so that then they could be cemented and become whole again. So why is understanding this process of social innovation important? Well, the first thing is that we can all produce innovations. You and I, we can also produce or create these practice innovations. We can repurpose resources like vacant lots, and we can give them new meanings, like repurposing them, their meaning, from a blighted place to a place teeming with wildlife and civic life. And we can also build new skills, like working across generations. And why is understanding innovation or practice innovation per se important? Well, practice innovations, including civic ecology practices, are needed as we transition to a more sustainable and a more resilient society. We can envision each civic ecology practice as an innovation or an experiment, and we're learning through all these experiments. And what we learn is going to be very important as we adapt to a somewhat uncertain future.